I'm Dane Rose, and what I'd like to articulate in this video are all of the various problems and irritations or inefficiencies that I've encountered as a globe-setting male at this time in history, and then proceed to look at the purpose and core focus of Happiness Data, which is a nonprofit venture that in some way is a personal response to these problems, and in a larger way comes out of the thought that if I'm experiencing these pain points, these inefficiencies, these problems, then millions of others are experiencing some version of the same problems. And it behooves us to develop a set of ideas, an intelligent response, which gets to one of my talents, which is synergistic design. And by synergy, I just mean that rather than trying to solve one problem in a very lineal way, with a very lineal and isolated solution, what good design is about is identifying dozens of separate pain points and then weaving those together in some ways a very simple response, but a very elegant response, a response that addresses everything simultaneously. So let's look at some of these problems, and they're very mundane at one level, but they're very big in their implication at another level. Let's start with the fact that I now have a dog, but because I travel a lot, and because I don't want to put my dog in a kennel of yapping other dogs with strangers, I haven't had a dog for most of my life. Now that dog generates 20% of my daily joy. And yet, for decades of my life, due to sometimes a landlord not wanting a dog, sometimes a travel schedule, or just the hassle of navigating through when I went to adopt a dog, there were all kinds of hurdles that just, it's like it was almost as if the dog rescue agency thought that they were doing me a big favor by helping me rescue a dog. And I just never got around to it. And so I came up with co-owning a dog. I wanted to find someone with whom we could share a dog, facilitating social connection, but also so that the dog would have more variety and interest, living with me when I was in town and with someone else when I was out of town about half the year. And I failed to find someone to co-own the dog. And so it wasn't until I met my wife that we could share the responsibilities and actually own a dog, which not only helped a dog, but instantly added 20% to the quality of my life. Now, one of the other problems that I've experienced in the last few years is going through a very deep therapeutic and sexual trauma with a therapist and realizing that I found myself in a state that was not bridgeable, meaning there's no 12-step programs for victims of therapeutic sexual abuse. And there's no basis in our culture for having a conversation when you're in those most vulnerable feelings. And everyone's asking how you are. But absolutely no one wants to hear, well, I'm out of my depth, I'm dissociated, I feel like I'm developing PTSD, and my therapist has sexually abused me. And no, going to court is not an answer for those feelings. It may be a legal answer, etc., but I really need help sorting this through. And I looked around at the San Francisco Bay Area, having lived here for 15 years, and I could not find, and no one came to mind, that wanted to explore those topics. And when a therapist abuses you, you don't exactly want to go out and hire another therapist to fix the first therapist's abuse, particularly when many therapists are defensive or do not understand the terrain of either trauma, PTSD, sexual abuse, the amount of anger that elicits towards therapists, particularly when the one runs off without a refund, etc. So this was a crisis. And I solved that by going overseas and doing hundreds of hours of very slow massage in Philippines and in Thailand, and being in a more feminine and gentle culture that would heal that. And I'm thinking, well, what happens to all the other children, men and women in America who have the same wall of discomfort when they talk about the real issues and have nowhere to turn to? And that really struck a chord with me. Where does, particularly a man in a culture where it's low ranking for a man to break down, to be in a helpless state, where does that man go in the United States, particularly if they have an abusive family history? They can't go back to their family. And they can't go to their clients. And they can't go to their boss. And an hour a week of therapy isn't going to cut it. It's like that really struck me, because there is rampant sexual abuse in our culture. And so many of our people are left alone in the silence of collusion, because it is a cultural collusion, and I wanted to respond to that. And I felt lucky to have enough money in the bank to be my own boss, to be familiar with places around the world where I could go. But what about other people? It's another problem. On a much lighter note, I learned to play ping pong in Thailand. I found it was my favorite, quote, sport, my favorite game. It's just tons of fun. And coming back in the US, I couldn't find a ping pong partner. And, you know, in that same vein, a ping pong partner where one could be real and actually talk about what's going on rather than make small talk. Another problem is a lot of these problems, when I think of them, are systemic. And so it takes an inordinate amount of work for one person to create a microculture of one. But it becomes very easy if people work to create a culture together. How does that occur? And what's the amount of scale needed before the question can be, what is the optimal protocol, the optimal design, as opposed to, is it worth that for me personally to reinvent the wheel and create an entirely new life? So a problem with, this is a good idea, but it would need the neighborhood to participate. Another issue. For years, the best way to stay integrated for me is to notice when I want to spend time with someone, and notice the amount of time and the attention that that would require, and then do that today. This integrates the heart, the mind, the body, the energy level, and brings it all together because it's spontaneous. And I'd call people up and say, do you have 3 or 4 hours today? And they'd say, call me next week. But I don't have the time. I don't have the feeling. I don't have, now that switches from something I'm ready to do now to something I have to do later. And I solved that problem by going to Thailand, where it's 1,000% easier to create large amounts of quality time. But again, shutting down my business 6 months of the year so that I could experience spontaneity, it's a big trade-off. Is there not some way that I can be in my own country and actually create quality time? And I have not been able to crack that in the San Francisco Bay Area, so I just go overseas. Now, another factor that I notice with the Facebook phenomena, and it's one of the reasons I'm not on Facebook, but it's also in the dating culture, that what everyone wants on a first date is to hear that this is going to be easy, fun, light. There's not going to be any problems, any baggage, and it's all going to be relaxed and comfortable and funny. And then we're going to have sex, and then we'll get on with our lives, and who knows when the change or whether we'll see each other again, and this, that. And so there's a focus on it all being very nice right now. The problem is, and this is pointed out by Jordan Peterson, that when you have that kind of one-date thinking, you never make hard investments in yourself or in the other person that will pay off 10 years down the road. You don't get together and say, I'd really like to sort out my retirement IRA, and I'm wrestling with this and this and this and this. And the person's like, I don't want to talk about that. I want this to be fun. I don't want to deal with that. And so there's this focus on the short term at the expense of the long term. And as any investor will tell you, that leads to long-term poverty and mediocrity. Another problem that I experienced as I would travel is that you'd come to a place, like there's a community I lived in Findhorn in Scotland. It's an exceptionally good community at certain things. And nobody I know has been there. And so there's no shared experience. There's no common language. And so if I want to bring some aspect that's missing in the immediate environment that's done very well over there, there's no one that even knows what that is in order to communicate around it. On a more practical note, as a teenager when I was living in England, I noticed that they had dual flush toilets. And I noticed that they had giant keys, meaning the key to my 400-year-old house in England was literally this long, this big. It was heavy, easy to pick, and it was a relatively new lock. It's like I'd never seen such an inefficient lock design in my entire life in the United States. But it's just accepted as normal in England. And at the same time, low flush toilets, which were all over the place in Europe, didn't seem to make it over to the US. And that's a metaphor. If you expand that out 1,000 times, what I took from that was that there is stuff in every country and in every culture that is profoundly absurd, that is only happening because no one bothered to go over to another place and then say, we should be doing that, and then brought it back, because it's hard to do on an individual level. Because they'd have had to sell different locks at the hardware store. The people would have to know that different locks existed. They'd have to make doors for the different locks. Then it's intelligent and actionable. But there's so many things like that that take a concerted, organic effort to make a change. But the change has already been proven and is being done 10 times better somewhere else. How do you try and bring together the best from many countries, from many cultures, from many practices, rather than just doing what's been done before? Now, this is not only the case with physical things, this is the case culturally, where, for example, when I spent time in Denmark and interviewed 30 people, I concluded that there were obvious reasons why the Danish people had a 400% higher quality of life than the average American. And what do you do with that data when Americans, as a general rule, are so culturally ignorant and arrogant that the fact that it is American is all that they need to know that it's a good thing? And so, what do you do with the fact that you could easily be living a 400% higher quality of life if you did nothing but copy Copenhagen? And nobody even knows that they don't know that, let alone, can a community respond to that? When I knock on my neighbors, this is another issue in San Francisco Bay Area, when I tried to organize the neighborhood, less than 10% of people even wanted to be engaged. Less than 10% of people grasped that there was a topic worth discussing, let alone a basis to meet some other neighbor. And so the synergies that are possible in a neighborhood could not be realized in any level when 90% of the neighborhood has an attitude of, I just come home here, I don't want to engage with anyone, and I go to work. Another issue that I dealt with is loneliness. And what I mean by this is particular parts of my personality, of who I know myself to be, that had no home. They weren't welcome at the coffee shop. They weren't welcome at the restaurant. They weren't welcome at the nearest meetup. Or they had a sliver of a home, meaning once a month you could go and do that. But there's no place for those parts to blossom. And what was upsetting to me in this realization was not that there wasn't a place for every part of me, but rather that the very best parts that I had experienced in other cultures and in other locations were the parts that were not only not welcome, it wasn't even conceived of that they weren't welcome. And so there was no basis to have a conversation around that. And this was a recurring problem I haven't been able to crack in the Bay Area. Now, another experience that I had in a year of, going back to the quality time issue, I couldn't find Bay Area women who wanted to spend an average of 30 hours a week together, which was a time that, having spent time with various people around the world, I had noticed was a sweet spot, meaning that there were all kinds of relationship challenges that didn't exist if you understood each other well enough and spent enough time together so that you could understand each other well enough and attune. But that if you didn't spend enough time, like the average person I spoke with, when I would see if it was a possible fit for a relationship, there was no problem getting sex. There was no problem getting a little, adrenaline. But when I'd say, well, how many hours would you be interested in spending if this relationship goes somewhere? The average answer was 10. And I've never been able to sustain and rapidly grow in a relationship that had so little time. And this, I couldn't make that connection. So I went overseas, and I've married a Filipina, because that's a culture where relationships are valued more than they are in the San Francisco Bay Area. So I solved it that way. But it took a good 10 years of loneliness to want to realize the best potential of relationship and just, having lots of lovers that didn't grasp what was being missed. And there's a certain loneliness that comes when you don't know the other person, and when they don't know you, and when they don't know that they don't know you. It's always rather surprising. I would have women be shocked that they didn't know what they didn't know. It's like, well, how in your protocol of having no time and not asking and not listening, how would you have known that? And they hadn't sorted that out. And so it just seemed like part of the cultural ethic of chauvinism to devalue the feminine, to devalue relationship, but still expect it to just magically work. This ties in with the problem of invisibility, because I would say that in 99% of all my Western relationships, people didn't know a good 70% of the possibilities in the relationship, and they didn't know that they didn't know it. And this is, incredibly frustrating. Now, another cultural challenge, that ties in with this is, as an American business owner and a contractor, I am ranked for being, quote, professional. And what this means is low emotional, low personal, and efficient, neutral, very conventional, and getting things done, which I do very well. I rank high and am paid very well when I employ that expected protocol. But for me personally, I have usually been more interested in the marital dynamics of my clients or their children than in constructing and designing a garden, a landscape, or a house. And those values, meaning the values of family and consciousness and relationship, were low-ranking. The values of, material accomplishment were high-ranking. And so when you pay someone well and praise them for being a certain way, and you pay them poorly and criticize them for being another way, just because that's the norm in the culture, it doesn't matter that the family is, in fact, if you do the happiness research, more important than the garden. It doesn't matter. Because you're being looked at through the lens of the culture, not through the lens of the data. There's a big split between the science of culture, or between science and culture. And culture prevails whenever there is unconsciousness and not enough time to talk about it. And since we're such a busy culture, there isn't time to talk about it. And so this has been an ongoing and frustrating choice, to have to choose to be paid well and well liked for doing something that is not terribly important, and to be misunderstood and ignored for doing something that's actually very important. And even if we say, oh, well, you could be a therapist, it's like, no, it's not the way it works either. Because when you put on a show for a therapist over at their office once a month or once a week, you don't get to see the family dynamic I would see when I was in and around the house. So the therapeutic dynamic doesn't work in many cases. You're not the same person at home as you are in the therapy appointment. And many people put on agendas and filters to show up and perform for the therapist. And so that, it also seems odd, where you'd go to someone else's house to say what it's like to be at your house, and you'd rather do that than invite someone that sees and understands your family in the family situation. So I would say ranked for mediocrity is how I would describe that. Tying in with not enough spontaneous and quality time. Typical people want to talk for 20 minutes to an hour. But my experience was that the really meaningful conversations took an average of 4 hours, and would have a mix of a meal and some conversation and maybe a walk. They took time to not feel pressured, and for the best parts of both people to blossom in that time. How do you find those times when you're in a culture that's working 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 hours a week with commute? There just isn't the time for the best part in both people to emerge and grow in relationship. Now, when it came to architecture, I built my first house at 23. I've designed a whole variety of things. I was consistently shunted towards less efficient, less beautiful, more expensive houses than I wanted to build by city codes. The first house I wanted to build for myself was 640 square feet. I submitted the plans and they said, well, we don't allow any plan under 900 square feet. I said, well, I don't need the extra square footage. This is more environmentally sustainable. It's more cost effective. It's smaller, so the neighbors don't have to look at it as a big monstrosity. They said, we don't care. That's the code. So running into over and over again, and that represents about 500 different codes that are systematically precluding healthy and intelligent alternatives for architecture, and just legislating those alternatives out of existence for no reason. They're absurd. And so this is a regular and very large gripe with engaging with Western technology. The current house I'm considering building, they won't let me build it unless it's at least 1,200 square feet. And the codes and the permits cost more than building the entire house. I mean, that's absurd. So another issue that I see in a very large sense is Elon Musk is pushing hard to make our species interplanetary. It's a beautiful goal. The moon, space stations, Mars, it's a good hedge, and it's a great cultural experiment. But I don't want to export status quo American culture to Mars. What happens when you have $1 trillion infrastructure and you have one raging partner who cheats on the other partner and blows the hatch, and $1 trillion of culture goes up in smoke because we don't teach emotional literacy in our school? We don't teach relationship dynamics. It's incredibly inefficient to keep focusing so much on the outer technology without building the inner technology to create sustainable, healthy relationships. I've always been interested in environmentalism, and that leads me right back to tiny houses, which leads me right up against the law in many cases. And you can't, as an individual, justify a 5-year court battle with your own government fighting your own public money for the right to build a tiny house. But as a community, as a group, it is one of the most intelligent things that we can advocate for: the right to live and create intelligent ecological design. So currently there's a big tension: government and an environment, science and culture, individual and status quo. One of the biggest accomplishments that I've created is the ability to work an average of 4 hours a day and sustain even the incredibly inefficient lifestyle of US culture, which costs me around $10,000 a month as an individual. Now, that's something I've done a lot to orchestrate. But if sustainable design was not precluded by law, I've already helped my assistant and my wife create a 4-hour-a-day lifestyle, which of course frees up an extra 4 hours a day for community and an extra 4 hours a day for nourishing personal growth and development and free time. That is a huge component in the goal of having a higher quality life with a smaller ecological footprint. And that is currently being precluded systemically, largely in the Bay Area by the cost of housing, where you can't even buy a unit for less than $600,000. But when housing could be 10 times cheaper and more environmentally sustainable. Were it not for current legislation, it makes it a really important push to be able to create a framework to build intelligent housing. Now, once you reach a certain age and you've developed a lot in gifts, I've invested $250,000 in personal development, traveled worldwide, read 500 books in just the last 5 years alone. You want to give back, particularly when you understand the mediocrity of current education. Now, when I tried to volunteer at my local school, there was complete apathy and distaste for the idea, and no portal to bring my knowledge to the children. The teachers saw me as a threat. The children never got to make the choice. So even a school within walking distance is not something I can be a mentor in that framework. That's a huge grief and loss of the culture. And so an intelligent solution includes a solution where those who are competent and have spent decades developing certain skills can share them freely with the community in a way that is easy and honored, as opposed to punished and bureaucratized out of existence. Now, I live in the 5th wealthiest county in the United States, and I see the same elderly homeless people day after day after day walking our streets with grocery carts. And my city would say there's no solution. We can't all buy them $600,000 housing units. And so they're left to suffer the inept policies of our culture in housing policy. But they could easily put together a tiny house or afford the $300 a month rent that a tiny off-grid home could easily be created for that purpose. And so that really bothers me, that we punish our elderly, our mentally ill, to maintain our status quo. And so that's a problem that needs to be solved. I also like being nice to the elderly, and I don't know any elderly people. We have a culture that shames people and that assumes that people like me who have a business to run wouldn't want to waste their time with human beings. That's not true at all. But how exactly in this culture would I go and comfort an elderly person when I'm viewed suspiciously in this culture for that? So I can do that in Thailand, and I do. I can do it a bit in the Philippines, because in that culture they take care of their elderly. So it's viewed as normal. But do you really have to travel overseas before taking care of the elderly is considered intelligent and normal? And the same is true with children. I love children. And since I can't engage with them in the school, and since I don't have children, and since the neighbors don't want to get together, I run into children in parks. I have 10 seconds in America before I'm being viewed as a pedophile, and that hurts and is absurd. Now in Thailand, again, I can hang out with kids for an hour. So I spend 6 months of the year over there. I have a little apartment, and I get to be a human being in another culture, not my own. That is a huge grief and a huge problem. Now, my wife and I are artists, and our house is already filled with art. Nobody sees it in this busy culture. And where's the place to share art within a community framework? There is no place, and so it actually stifles the creativity, because the fun thing would be to share it and give it away and have it in community spaces so that we could all enjoy it. That doesn't work within the module of an individual house is just an individual house. And none of the neighbors, well, I think one neighbor has been inside my house in 15 years. I mean, it's absurd. So that's another grief, the lack of ability to share art. Another issue is travel. meaning my house costs $4,000 a month and it stays empty 6 months of the year. And it's not sustainable. I can do that because I've designed my life carefully for 25 years to be able to do that. But with a more eco-community framework with small individual dwellings and lots of common space, those costs go way down and you can afford to travel and leave a space open, which is very healthy. Travel has been very beneficial, particularly to older cultures, China, Philippines, Thailand in particular. Now, good media, that's somewhat solved with YouTube and TED Talks and good documentaries. But there's surprisingly little good media on culture, cultural design, how to start an eco-village, what's going on in your individual community so that you can get to know people. It's usually national or international media. And the media that's, of course, most interesting is those that we can act at. I wrote to my local theater about a documentary I'm doing on local homelessness. They're not particularly interested in collaborating. I don't know why, but it's cultural. They don't place any value on the intimacy of the local area. And as is so often the case with our isolated thinking, they're thinking it's not my job description to collaborate to create a local media production. They don't even respond. And I wonder how many local-oriented projects are being met with those cold shoulders which stifle intimacy and meaning for any town, for any community. Now, another thing, if I sit down in a cafe and approach an American, I am viewed as suspicion, and sometimes what they say is, well, I don't know you. And so we sit for an hour in a cafe at a similar table or next door in silence. And they don't know me. They don't know my skills. They don't know my interests. They don't know how I could help them. They don't know how they could help me. And they don't invest to find that out. It's a wasted hour compared to releasing the possibilities with that individual. And so how do you solve this problem when you could be sitting right next to the very person who has all the information that you most need for your most vital concerns, and you don't even know that you don't know it, and it just passes you by? Work-home separation is a big thing that divides marriages. I have to go at this schedule of work, you have to go at that schedule of work, I'm going here, you're going there, which means that in a culture where you spend more time at work than you do building your marriage, you're spending more time with other people than yourselves. The body relates to the people it's near, not to ideas of a marriage. So to have a marriage, you've actually got to spend a certain amount of time together with your children and your family. That's not being facilitated in current culture. Or if I want to go off on a travel trip, and my wife would lose her job if she went, how do you do that? Well, I've sorted that out personally by giving my wife a job that she enjoys and is good at, so that she doesn't have to stop and get fired if we want to travel. But what about everyone else? Educational irrelevance. I've gone to Waldorf schools, I've done homeschooling, I've attended public schools in Canada, England, and the US, Cyprus, and Scotland. And there is an 80% inefficiency that I've observed in every one of those protocols except the homeschooling. And so I think there's the easy capacity for education to be 80% more relevant and interesting than most institutionalized education, but that is not being listened to. Parents have rarely taken me up on the opportunity to learn how to do that kind of homeschooling. They like the results. They say, oh, I wish my kid could be like you. It's like they can. But then I don't want to break the mold. Now, another issue that I have in a similar vein is I share books, I write books, I share things that I teach, and usually I never see those people again. And so, in that sense, it costs me because there's no container to hold that information. Well, why? Well, when you're in a town of 50,000 people, what are the odds you're going to run into each other and that's going? And so it actually disincentivizes long-term thinking and investments in the general public and in the community because they don't come back in a very self-centered culture. But when you have a small group that's together over time, every investment you make in the other person, you get to see the joy of watching them grow, which is a motivation, but they also become a stronger and more developed person, which means that you're relating to stronger and more developed people, and it leads to vision and investment. One of the biggest sadnesses I experience regularly is the awareness that I am valued for my money more than my humanity. That really, what is being served in most of my US interactions, which are financial, meaning I can find someone to do just about anything for money. And if I've got money to spend, I can buy just about everything. And just about everyone will sell it to me. But almost no one's buying humanity and presence. I can't stick up a hand and say I've got an hour to listen to someone who'd like to be listened to and have people prioritize the human being over the money. Or if I want to be heard, can any of you at all that I encountered today show up out of the kindness and joy to listen to me for 1, 2, 3 hours and connect? Well, we're here in business. Yeah, I know. I'm actually asking if anyone is here in humanity. You want to buy anything or not? The overvaluing of money, a symbol of value, and the undervaluing of human beings. You look at the millions of homeless in America. Why are they homeless? It's not because they're bad people. It's because they don't have money. If they had money, they'd have homes. Every one of them would have multiple homes if homes cost $1. Millions of Americans don't have any home because housing is outside of their reach. Chauvinism, the valuing of things and money, the valuing of masculine traits over feminine traits, is a painful experience I've run into hundreds of thousands of times. It's very painful. Again, I go overseas to compensate for that. It feels great. But it's also a bit dissociative to have to leave my country in order to feel like a human being. One of my frustrations is I have an entire garage filled with tools that could be in operation 24/7. They're not. Most of them get used less than 2% of the hours each year. But they all have to be there in case I need them. So we've got 98% wastage. A lot of my space, I've talked about the house sitting empty 6 months of the year. I've got crystals. So theft and breakage, you can damage a $10,000 crystal very easily if you don't know what you're doing. And so it's kind of I don't really want to do Airbnb. But if I knew people, it'd be so nice to share more of the space and have that as a currency within a framework of trust and intimacy. I do not have any male friends in the United States. And it's not for lack of trying. I've invited at least 50. I've had 2 for a period of time. And the amount of effort and initiation it takes to get a man to show up 4 hours a week so that there's something substantive, so that you actually get to know each other, is enormous. And no male has ever come to me in an entire lifetime wanting to put up that effort and asking me. I've asked 50. 2 said yes for about 5 years. And I just can't get around to asking another 50 right now. So I do not have any male friends in my own culture. I think that is an absolute tragedy. And I think that friendships emerge much more naturally when you're in close proximity. But how do you do that when you all eat separate meals in separate kitchens at separate times, watching separate TV programs and playing with different phone apps? Where's the shared proximity when the culture has idealized profound excessive redundancy, meaning we have generated more waste and have consumed more energy per capita than any culture of 10,000 cultures in the entire history of the planet. All so that we can operate as completely autonomous, and often, if you look at one of the US studies where 78% of people regularly feel lonely, of course they do. They're not eating together. They're not sleeping together. They're not cooking and washing dishes together. They're not gardening together. They're not painting together. They're not playing games together. They're doing their own thing in their own world, which is not the origin of our species. We are a pack mammalian species. So these are a couple of the crises, and I began talking about diversity of relationships when I couldn't find anyone to spend more than 10 hours a week, and I knew that I wanted a good 30 or more hours a week. I just suggested to the women who wanted to sleep with me and spend 10 hours that I have 3 lovers, and together have 30 hours. They were fine with that, rather than make time. But I learned something interesting for the year that I did that, which is that every lover, every close friendship draws out a unique flavor within the person. I was a great chef with one. I gave and exchanged great gifts with another. I played tennis and did a lot of normal things with another. I had transcendent tantric sex, mystical experiences with another. Completely different parts of me connecting with completely different parts in others. And the current cultural framework does not allow intimacy, meaning close emotional connection, with more than usually 1 or 2 people in this very tight, busy framework. But I have seen, and it doesn't matter whether you're sexual or not, but when you spend quality time in an emotional way with a variety of people, you get to experience, I got to experience myself as a whole person. And I got to see which parts of me were about the other person and which parts were me. Because there were certain things that stayed the same throughout. I never lied to a partner. I always liked to be transparent. I mean, how many conversations have you had like this with someone in your culture? I like transparency. So that was there in all of them. But I was a great chef with one because she loved my cooking. The others, I was a great artist and giver of gifts with another because they were an artist and loved to give gifts. Neither of those 2 knew the alchemy of transcendent sexuality. So they never had a mystical sacred experience, but another that just emerged naturally. There was richness in each relationship. And when you spend quality time on a regular basis with multiple people, we get to see who we are. And Facebook and disembodied time is not a substitution for that. And it disintegrates people to have mental relationships that are not in sync with the way they're spending their time. So these are many of the problems. I would say, a final one in mentioning that many of the people who say, oh, that's a great idea, that's interesting growth, or wow, where did you learn all that, don't have time to keep in a loop of personal growth because they're working so hard. So that's, finding people who will grow with you because they're in a similar cultural environment of spending, a good 4 hours a day investing in community and investing in ourselves is a really big issue. And I'll turn briefly to a few other problems. As I say, I've read 500 books. But if I talk to you and you don't know which books I've read and I don't know which books you've read, there's no basis for shared conversation around those books. And when you work together as a community and have a book club and everyone understands certain terminologies, the books become exponentially more valuable because they're acted on. When the average interaction takes 1 to 2 weeks to plan and consumes a good hour in logistical travel time and maybe 2 or 3 phone calls, one of the things I experience in the Bay Area is that I spend more time planning a meeting than actually being at the meeting, which is backwards, because the planning and the travel and all the pollution that goes out in the environment and the drive doesn't have any value. It's a negative value. I've also had numerous situations where I've wanted to do something that would express some part of me, like I'm making a film. And it took me 2 years to personally create this place and this setup so that I can make a film when I want to. And this, of course, sits empty 90% of the time as well. A safe, quiet place to make media is a thing that many people don't have. And, and so I've solved that myself, but what about everyone else who could be sharing media with the world in a meaningful way? I'm getting rid of my sailboat because it sits 99% of the time, and I can't justify keeping it for 1% use. And there's no framework to share it. But if there's 100 people all sharing one sailboat, it's used a lot and has a lot more diversity as you go out sailing together. Child safety and pet safety. When you have the road and then the garden and then the house, every little home has to be walled off so that the child or the dog doesn't go out into the road. And you hear road noise coming in. But when parking is regulated to a specific area and a large area of land with small, tiny houses is all fenced off, now all that anxiety goes off and everyone knows the unique traits of specific children and animals and participates in what was a much more traditional form of a village raising a child, rather than a frayed and hectic parent. We need real human scale. Psychologists and anthropologists find that if you're spending time with more than 150 people, you can't stay integrated. But if you have groups of 10 to maybe 150 people max, you can connect and the intimacy deepens. You remember each other's birthdays, you remember each other's names, your pet names, the dog names, how not to touch this person on the shoulder because they've got a bad shoulder. You know who needs something when you've got an extra one. You have an intimacy level that creates meaning, a sense of personality and flow. There's also an issue, back to the stranger thing, I'm not trusted, which means that it disincentivizes me to, for example, I've never lied to a friend or partner. Well, if you live with someone for 5 years in close proximity, you learn, oh, this person's working hard to tell the truth. This person lies all the time. And so you treat those people differently in the community, which incentivizes trust building. When everyone's a stranger and everyone gets treated at the lowest common denominator, I'm frequently irritated that people assume I'm an axe murderer simply because they don't know me and don't take the time. And it's like, well, what's the point of cultivating these qualities that are really important in community if people can't differentiate them? And so a basis, there needs to be a basis for understanding where we can trust each one of us in which categories. You're a great surgeon, you're a good truth teller, you're a great articulator, you're very reliable, you're always late. Okay, we can count on that pattern because we know each other. And everyone has strengths and weaknesses that need to be known. Now, there's a lot of problems that with good design you can eliminate altogether. And if you don't have a good synergistic design, you spend lots and lots of money solving problems that would be quite cheap to prevent. And you have the situation where, for example, we're creating in my city homelessness by refusing to create and allow low-cost housing. And at the same time, police budgets are escalating to manage all of the homeless people created. But there's more money being spent on policing than it would take to house the homeless. It's worked out to be $65,000 per each homeless person in extra policing, ER visits, community problems, park redesign, all the various ripple effects. Not to mention that it's a miserable culture to live in when not a single person in the city will help the elderly and mentally ill and rebellious children, etc., to actually have a safe, legal place to sleep. So these are the problems. And the focus that I have for happiness data, happiness data was a response to another problem, which is, as I work 6 months of the year, and then I do things that I think are worthwhile the other 6 months. And how it's currently set up is I would have to pay, or how it was set up is I'd have to pay taxes. If I took $2,000 and did a project to help some worthy cause, I would be taxed on the $2,000. And I like the personal touch as opposed to just sending it off to a nameless nonprofit and having no idea what's happening with that money or who's affected by it, and certainly not growing as an individual. So I created happiness data to solve that problem. And having created it, there's a lot of different interests that I have. 10x relationships, meaning relationships that are 10 times more valuable per energy invested than a typical relationship. Looking at cultural design ideas, looking at relevant global media, looking at 10x thinking, looking at cultural design, and looking at trauma and trauma management and sexual abuse. And what all of this stuff has in common is the idea of wanting to create and actively creating expertise that allows groups of people in the 10 to 150 range apiece to come together and simultaneously create 10 times more value per time, money, and natural resources invested than current traditional lives. And in the process, to reduce the cost of living to a point where anyone can afford that. And in the process, to pioneer a culture that is worthy of being taken to another planet, because it's 10 times more valuable and efficient than our culture. And by efficient, I don't mean producing more things. I mean producing more value. Many of us have way too many things and are still depressed, exhausted, and could use value. We could use a lot more value and a lot less things, or a lot more shared things. So the spokes around this wheel are developing media that's relevant for intentional culture and community, developing protocols for creating exportable value. For example, I'm very interested in virtual assistant and media creation. Ways of reducing cost while simultaneously increasing value to living. The technology of 10x thinking, tackling a set of problems like this and coming up with something that costs less money and time to solve all of these problems than is spent creating them, and that is spent with the current budget, meaning I'm spending $10,000 a month to have all of these problems created by my culture. But I could be spending $2,000 or $3,000 a month and be in a culture where all of these problems are solved. And that's one of the gifts of traveling, is I get to learn who's doing what well in different parts of the world. Growth-oriented relationships, creating transparency in an intranet format where you get to see people. For example, no one in my government or community has ever asked me what my gifts are and what my role could be to best contribute to community and culture. Now that's a huge blind spot. No one in 40 years asked a community member how could they contribute the best gift. And you see those things and you realize, well, nobody's asking you either. Nobody's asking anyone else. That is a wasted opportunity. There's an opportunity to ask 10 times better questions and to make that information available through app technology and intranet. Architectural training, so that we have top multiple options for food growing, energy production, waste management, recycling, living together, refrigeration, tackling each of the different aspects of living as a 10x formula, how to design it from scratch to be 10 times more valuable per unit of energy invested. Teaching this as a recipe and exporting it so that many people around the world can borrow and learn from these groups, and so that people can migrate with talents within multiple cultures. Microcultures is the way I would see them, in micro-communities, is one of the most valuable things I think we can undertake as a species at this time, to consciously create scientific micro-communities. Because one of the other problems that is irritating is when you look at the happiness data from scientific metrics, you find big anomalies. For example, if you have an extra hour of sleep in America, your happiness will go up more than if you work an hour of overtime. But if you ask the typical American, would you rather have an extra hour of overtime or an extra hour of sleep, a majority of Americans will pick the overtime and be less happy. The culture and the data are diverging in these areas, and everyone is suffering. The children of that overworked parent suffer, the marriage suffers, the health suffers, and a delusion that money is more important than well-being is maintained. We don't die well in this culture. I haven't had to deal with that problem, but I'm aware of it. I'm aware that there's no place that I know to die well in this culture. And I'd like to create such a place where each of us can have a good death, a good dying, a good grieving, and have access to the full range of emotional technology, because we take some of the time obsessively working in our culture to actually become emotionally literate. So, if we look at 10xliving.org, it's the beginnings of a technology, of a mapping system. And there is a role for every one of us to play in building out, finding the places where a government will not harass a group of people trying to create a 10x microculture. Whether it's an abandoned town where real estate is selling cheap, but going about it in a network so that every microculture that's being created is sharing metadata with every other microculture, so we see which protocols are working, and all within the umbrella of 10x design and following the science rather than the dogma, rather than the status quo or the culture, which of course requires personal investment, which means you have to have time to personally invest. And so a lot of these are catch-22s. I've very deliberately kept my company small so that I could have more and more time. So that's the focus of Happiness Data, is in the design of, production of, facilitation of, and participation in conscious microcultures. And to move towards that as individuals within the abilities that we have right now. If it's an hour a week for you and you're willing to show up in a particular role, if I do my job well, I can show you a role, or you can pick one, and the collective can grow in a virtual framework until it's built out enough to start taking shape in physical framework. This is the great work of our time. The awareness that there have been 10,000 cultures in human history, that our culture is currently consuming significantly, sometimes a factor of 100 times more energy and natural resources than any culture in human history, to be more miserable psychologically than many cultures in human history and many cultures around the world today. And that is not intelligent. And since we are enamored with the scientific method, and since the data supports going in the direction of conscious microcultures and more intentional and sustainable architecture, and more community with shared, where you share cooking, eating, group activities, gardening, and create community spaces where you can do things like paint, etc., and focus just on very simple, minimalistic living or sleeping quarters, so that a life is one of engagement, where you don't have to go off to the gym because you're participating in the production of your life and in the production of a culture that is worthy of being supported to another planet, using transparent metadata and app technology to make the entire thing visible, so that any country and that any community around the world can replicate from and learn from those processes, and so that we can continually learn from the successes and failures of everyone around the world who is endeavoring and engaging in the same process, with a vision that within 10 years we can move out and try different slices of different cultures around the world and have an active network of places to visit, and with the goal of producing compelling media that allows our elderly, our young, our teenagers, our rebels, our mentally ill, to engage with these protocols and create a healthier culture and healthier human beings.